The morning sun filtered through the dusty workshop windows as Xander rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the lingering exhaustion. His mind wandered to the previous night's demons, but he pushed them aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. The workshop, filled with the familiar scent of metal and leather, had become his sanctuary over the past few days. "Time to get to work," he muttered, running his fingers over the griffin leather he'd salvaged. The material was a rare find, and he intended to make the most of it. His recent encounter with the creature had left him with both valuable materials and a stark reminder of his own mortality. The workbench before him was organized with military precision, steel ingots to his left, etching tools to his right, and his precious runebook open in the center. Xander had spent years studying the ancient art of rune etching, but never had it been more crucial than now. Each mark he made could mean the difference between life and death in the trials to come. He began with the leg armor, methodically creating articulated plates that would allow for maximum mobility while maintaining protection. The process was meditative, each hammer strike purposeful, each fold of metal precisely calculated. The griffin leather would serve as binding between the plates, offering both flexibility and an additional layer of magical resistance. As he worked, his mind drifted to the conversation he'd had with Master Smith Aldrich the day before. The old craftsman's words echoed in his thoughts. "Boy, in this world, there are two types of artificers, those who create for glory, and those who create to survive. Figure out which one you are before it's too late." The morning stretched into afternoon as Xander completed the leg pieces. They were beautiful in their functionality, each plate flowing seamlessly into the next, the leather bindings perfectly tensioned. He stood, testing the movement, satisfied with the quiet whisper of metal on metal. But it wasn't enough. The world beyond his workshop was growing more dangerous by the day. The recent griffin attack was just the beginning, according to the rumors spreading through the town. Something was stirring in the wilderness, driving creatures closer to civilization, making them more aggressive. Xander moved on to the torso piece, his fingers tracing the ceramic plates he'd acquired. These would need special attention, the runes he planned to etch would need to be perfect. One mistake, one crossed line, and the entire enhancement could backfire catastrophically. He pulled out his runebook, flipping to the section on protective enchantments. The basic hardening runes were simple enough, but Xander had something more ambitious in mind. He'd been developing a new runic sequence, one that would theoretically create a reactive armor system. If it worked, the plates would momentarily reinforce themselves at the point of impact. Hours passed as he meticulously carved the experimental runes into the ceramic. Each stroke required absolute concentration, one slip could render the entire plate useless, or worse, unstable. The sun had begun to set when he finally completed the basic sequence. "Now for the test," he whispered, picking up a small hammer. He hesitated for a moment, then struck the plate with moderate force. The runes flickered to life, a faint blue glow spreading from the point of impact. The plate held. A smile crossed his face, the first genuine one in days. The basic concept worked, but there was still so much more to do. The arm pieces would need similar treatment, and the helm would be his masterpiece. As night fell, Xander lit the workshop's lamps, their warm glow casting long shadows across the floor. He couldn't stop now, not when he was making such progress. The armor was taking shape, becoming more than just protection, it was becoming an extension of himself, a second skin infused with his knowledge and craft. He began work on the arm pieces, scaling down the successful designs from the leg armor. The griffin leather proved its worth here, allowing for incredible flexibility around the joints while maintaining the structural integrity of the plates. Each piece was a puzzle, requiring perfect alignment and balance. The town's night watch bell rang midnight, but Xander barely noticed. He was lost in the flow of creation, his hands moving almost independently as they shaped metal and etched runes. The basic protection runes were now automatic for him, allowing his mind to work on the more complex problems ahead. The helm would be his greatest challenge. Traditional designs left too many vulnerabilities, but solid plates would restrict vision too much. His solution was revolutionary, a mesh of small holes, each reinforced with miniature runes. The theoretical work was solid, but putting it into practice would push his skills to their limit. As he worked on the helm's basic shape, Xander's thoughts drifted to his upcoming departure. In 2 days, he would need to leave this sanctuary and face whatever waited beyond the town's walls. The armor he was creating wasn't just a project, it was his lifeline. The first hints of dawn were creeping through the windows when Xander finally set down his tools. The basic structures of his armor were complete, but the real work, the runic enhancement that would truly bring it to life, was still ahead. He looked at his creations with critical eyes, noting every point that would need strengthening, every joint that could be improved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he had made progress. The crushing thoughts that had haunted him were held at bay by the satisfaction of creation. As he cleaned his workspace and prepared for a few hours of rest, Xander allowed himself a moment of pride. He was no longer just an artificer, he was becoming something more, something the world desperately needed. He just hoped it would be enough for what lay ahead. Dawn broke over the workshop as Xander prepared for the most crucial phase of his project, the runic enhancement. His workbench had been cleared of everything except the essential tools and his precious runebook. The armor pieces lay arranged before him like pieces of an elaborate puzzle, each awaiting its magical augmentation. The helm would be his starting point. Its innovative design required the most precise runic work he'd ever attempted. The mesh of holes he'd created needed to be reinforced without compromising the overall structure. Traditional runic patterns wouldn't suffice, he needed something new. Xander opened his runebook to a blank page and began sketching. The standard hardening rune was his foundation, but he modified it, creating smaller versions that could be repeated in a honeycomb pattern. Each hexagon would reinforce its neighbors, creating a web of protection that was greater than the sum of its parts. "Let's hope this works," he muttered, picking up his etching tool. The first rune would set the pattern for all others. His hand steady, he began the delicate process of carving the modified symbol into the metal. The rune glowed faintly as it was completed, a good sign. Hours passed as Xander meticulously covered the helm's surface with his innovative runic pattern. Each symbol had to be perfect, each connection precise. A single mistake could create a weak point in the protective matrix. The work was exhausting, requiring absolute concentration, but he couldn't afford to rush. As midday approached, he completed the final rune on the helm. The entire piece now hummed with magical energy, the runes creating a subtle, shifting pattern of light across its surface. Xander picked up his testing hammer, took a deep breath, and struck the helm with considerable force. The result exceeded his expectations. The runes flared brilliantly, dispersing the impact energy across the entire structure. Where a normal helm might have dented, his creation barely showed a mark. More importantly, the mesh of holes remained intact, maintaining visibility while providing superior protection. Encouraged by this success, Xander moved on to the torso plates. Here, he had another innovation in mind. Standard protection runes were passive, always active but never adapting. He wanted something more dynamic, armor that could learn from attacks and adjust its protection accordingly. The concept had come to him during his fight with the Griffin. Traditional armor was predictable, but creatures adapted their attacks. Why couldn't armor do the same? He began sketching a new runic sequence, combining elements of memory runes with standard protection enchantments. This work was even more delicate than the helm. Each plate needed its own runic circuit, but they also needed to communicate with each other. Xander created a master control rune in the center back plate, then began connecting it to the others through a series of linking runes. The sun had set by the time he completed the torso piece. Sweat dripped from his brow. Runic etching at this level was as mentally taxing as any physical labor. But he couldn't stop to rest. Time was running out, and he still had the arm and leg pieces to enhance. The arm pieces received a combination of his innovations. The forearm guards got the same mesh pattern as the helm, while the upper arm plates received modified versions of the adaptive protection system. He added extra runes for flexibility around the joints, ensuring the armor wouldn't restrict his movement. Midnight passed, and Xander's hands began to shake from exhaustion. The leg pieces still awaited their enhancement, but he knew he needed rest. Mistakes in runic work could be catastrophic. He forced himself to step away from the workbench, but his mind continued to work on the problems ahead. In his cot at the back of the workshop, Xander reviewed his plans for the remaining pieces. The leg armor would need something special, runes to assist with movement and stability. He'd read theories about enhancement runes that could store and release energy, potentially allowing for enhanced jumping or running. Sleep came fitfully, his dreams filled with glowing runes and shifting patterns of light. When he awoke a few hours later, his mind was clear, and he knew exactly what he needed to do. The leg pieces would be his masterpiece. Using principles from his adaptive armor design, he created a new runic sequence that would store kinetic energy from movement and release it when needed. In theory, it would make him faster, more agile, while still providing protection. The work consumed the entire morning. Each piece had to be perfectly aligned, the energy storage runes carefully balanced to prevent overload. By early afternoon, the entire suit was complete, each piece enhanced with his innovative runic designs. Xander stood in the center of his workshop, surrounded by his creation. The armor pieces gleamed in the afternoon light, runes pulsing with barely contained energy. It was time for the true test, wearing it all together. Piece by piece, he donned the armor. The leg pieces went on first, their weight surprisingly light thanks to the energy manipulation runes. The torso followed, its adaptive protection system humming to life as it synchronized with the other pieces. Arms and helm completed the set. Standing fully armored, Xander felt invincible. The armor moved with him perfectly, each piece working in harmony with the others. He could feel the runic systems adapting, learning his movements, becoming an extension of his will. But he knew better than to trust untested equipment. The real trials would begin tomorrow when he left the safety of the town. For now, he needed to run through every test he could think of to ensure his creation wouldn't fail him when he needed it most. The sun was setting on his second-to-last day in the workshop. Tomorrow would bring final adjustments and preparations for his journey. As he began removing the armor, Xander allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had created something unique, something that might just keep him alive in the challenges ahead. The crushing thoughts that had haunted him seemed distant now, replaced by a quiet confidence. He was ready for whatever came next, or at least, as ready as he could be. The final day in the workshop dawned clear and cool. Xander had spent a restless night thinking about all the tests he needed to run on his armor. Theory and basic trials were one thing, but he needed to be certain the armor would perform under real combat conditions. He began with basic mobility tests. Fully armored, he ran through a series of increasingly complex movements, running, jumping, rolling, and climbing over the workshop's furniture. The armor responded beautifully, its energy-storing runes actually helping with more explosive movements. Time for something more challenging, he said to himself, setting up a crude obstacle course. He needed to test the armor's ability to handle falls and impacts. Using wooden crates and rope, he created a series of platforms at various heights. The first few jumps were tentative, but as he grew more confident, Xander began to push the limits of what the armor could do. He discovered that the leg pieces could store enough energy from a running start to enhance his jump significantly. The impact absorption worked perfectly, allowing him to drop from heights that would normally be dangerous. Mid-morning brought weapons testing. He needed to know how the armor would handle different types of attacks. Setting up several testing dummies, Xander began with basic strikes using various weapons, swords, hammers, and spears he'd borrowed from the town's armory. The adaptive protection system proved its worth immediately. After taking a few hits from each weapon type, the armor began adjusting its defensive properties. Xander could feel the runic system's learning, strengthening areas that received repeated strikes while maintaining flexibility in others. The helm's mesh design exceeded expectations. Vision was clear and unrestricted, while the reinforced holes proved impenetrable to even the smallest weapon points. The honeycomb pattern of runes distributed impact force effectively, preventing any single point from bearing too much stress. But Xander wasn't satisfied with simple physical tests. He needed to know how the armor would handle magical attacks. While he couldn't replicate combat magic, he could test the armor's resistance to various types of energy. Using a series of simple runestones he'd created earlier, Xander subjected his armor to different magical effects. Heat, cold, electrical charge. Each test provided valuable information about how the runic systems responded to magical energy. The results were promising. The adaptive protection system proved capable of handling magical attacks as well as physical ones. More importantly, the armor seemed to be developing a sort of magical resistance, learning from each exposure and adjusting its defenses accordingly. As afternoon approached, Xander moved on to endurance testing. He needed to know how long the runic systems could maintain their enhancement effects. Fully armored, he began a series of demanding physical exercises, running laps around the workshop, performing combat drills, and maintaining defensive stances. Hours passed, and the armor showed no signs of weakening. The energy storage runes in the leg pieces continued to function perfectly, while the adaptive protection system maintained its responsiveness. Even the helm's reinforcement runes held their strength, despite the constant movement and impact tests. But the real breakthrough came accidentally. During a particularly strenuous sequence of movements, Xander noticed something unexpected. The armor was beginning to anticipate his actions. The runic systems weren't just learning from attacks, they were learning from him. Excited by this discovery, he began a new series of tests focused on this emerging capability. The results were remarkable. The armor was actually enhancing his natural movements, responding to his intentions almost before he made them. It was as if the armor was becoming an extension of his nervous system. "This is incredible," Xander muttered, running through another series of combat forms. The armor moved with him flawlessly, each piece working in perfect synchronization. The runic systems had evolved beyond his original design, creating something that was more than just protective gear. As evening approached, Xander began the final phase of testing, sustained combat simulation. He set up multiple attack scenarios, combining physical and magical challenges. The armor performed magnificently, adapting to each new threat while maintaining its enhanced responsiveness. The town's bells were ringing midnight when Xander finally ended his testing. His body was exhausted, but his mind was racing with the implications of what he'd discovered. The armor wasn't just a protective shell, it was a living system, capable of growth and adaptation. He spent the final hours of the night making minor adjustments, strengthening certain runes and fine-tuning others. Each modification was carefully documented in his runebook, along with observations about the armor's unexpected developments. As dawn approached on what would be his last day in the workshop, Xander knew he had created something revolutionary. The armor was ready, and more importantly, he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The crushing thoughts that had haunted him earlier were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He had taken his craft beyond its traditional boundaries, creating something that could change the future of combat artificing. Now all that remained was to prove it in real combat. The day of departure arrived with the first light of dawn. Xander stood in his workshop, methodically donning his armor for what would be its first real test. Each piece clicked into place with satisfying precision, the runic systems awakening with a familiar hum of energy. Last checks, he reminded himself, running through his mental checklist. The helm's mesh pattern glowed faintly as he activated its enhancement runes. The torso plates synchronized their adaptive protection systems, creating a seamless defensive network. Arm and leg pieces responded perfectly to his movements, their energy storage runes primed and ready. The town was just beginning to stir when he stepped out of the workshop. His enhanced armor drew curious glances from early morning workers, but Xander barely noticed. His mind was focused on the journey ahead, specifically, on the rumors of increased monster activity in the northern forests. Master Smith Aldrich was waiting at the town gates, his weathered face serious. "So, you're really going through with this?" he asked, examining Xander's armor with a critical eye. "Interesting design choices. Those holes in the helm, deliberate?" Xander nodded, explaining the mesh concept and its runic reinforcement. Aldrich listened intently, his expression shifting from skepticism to grudging approval. "Creative solution," he admitted. "But theories and tests are one thing. Real combat is another." "I know," Xander replied, checking his supplies one last time. "That's why I'm heading north. If the rumors are true, I'll get plenty of opportunities to prove the design." Aldrich handed him a sealed scroll. "Take this to the Rangers' outpost if you make it that far. They've been asking for an artificer's assessment of the situation." He paused, then added, "Try not to die. Good artificers are hard to find these days." With a final nod to his mentor, Xander passed through the gates. The northern road stretched before him, winding through increasingly wild territory. According to recent reports, several merchant caravans had been attacked along this route, though none could provide clear descriptions of their attackers. The morning passed quietly as Xander maintained a steady pace. The armor performed perfectly, its energy storage systems actually making his movement easier than it would have been unarmored. He used the time to focus on the armor's adaptive features, feeling how it responded to different movements and terrain. It was near midday when he got his first real test. The road curved around a dense thicket, and his helm's enhanced visibility allowed him to spot the ambush before walking into it. 3 creatures, something like wolves but larger and with too many eyes, were waiting in the undergrowth. Xander didn't hesitate. He activated the armor's combat systems fully for the first time, feeling the rush as all the runic enhancements synchronized. The creatures burst from cover, moving with unnatural speed, but Xander was ready. The first beast launched itself at his throat, only to be met by the helm's reinforced mesh. Its claws scraped harmlessly across the surface as Xander grabbed it mid-leap and used its momentum to throw it into its packmate. The armor's strength enhancement made the movement feel effortless. The third creature circled more cautiously, its multiple eyes studying him. It was learning, adapting its strategy, but so was Xander's armor. He could feel the protection systems analyzing the threats, adjusting their responses based on the creature's attack patterns. When the beast finally struck, it aimed for what it perceived as a weak point, the joints between plates. But the armor's adaptive system had anticipated this, reinforcing those areas while maintaining flexibility. Xander's counterattack was decisive, his enhanced strength and speed allowing him to dispatch the creature quickly. The other 2 beasts recovered and attacked together, but Xander was now fully in tune with his armor's capabilities. He moved with supernatural grace, the energy storage runes in his leg pieces allowing him to leap and dodge with incredible agility. Each attack he blocked taught the armor more, making its protection more effective. The fight ended quickly after that. As the last creature fell, Xander took a moment to assess his armor's performance. Not a single plate had been compromised, and the runic systems were already incorporating the combat data they'd gathered. But something else had happened during the fight, something unexpected. The armor's adaptive systems had begun predicting attack patterns, adjusting their protection before strikes even landed. It was as if the armor was developing its own combat intuition. Xander spent some time examining the creature's remains, noting details that might be important for his report to the Rangers. The mutations he observed, the extra eyes, the unnaturally dense muscle structure, suggested something was affecting the local wildlife, something beyond normal magical influence. As he continued his journey north, Xander reflected on the armor's performance. The test combat had proven his designs worked even better than anticipated, but it had also revealed new possibilities he hadn't considered. The armor wasn't just protecting him, it was evolving, learning, becoming something more than mere equipment. The sun was beginning its descent when he spotted smoke rising from the trees ahead, the Ranger's outpost. He'd made good time, thanks to the armor's enhancements. But something about the smoke pattern seemed wrong. It was too thick, too dark for normal campfires. As he crested the final hill, Xander saw why. The outpost was under attack, surrounded by creatures similar to but larger than the ones he'd fought earlier. The Rangers were holding their own, but they were outnumbered. Xander felt his armor's system surge to full combat readiness. This would be the real test, not just of his creation, but of himself as a combat artificer. As he rushed to join the battle, he couldn't help but smile. The crushing thoughts that had haunted him days ago were gone, replaced by absolute confidence in his abilities and his armor. The real trials were just beginning. The Ranger's outpost was a scene of chaos when Xander arrived. Mutated creatures swarmed the wooden palisade while Rangers fought desperately to maintain their defenses. His armor's enhanced vision showed him everything in stark detail, including the strange, pulsing crystals embedded in the larger creatures' bodies. Without hesitation, Xander threw himself into the battle. His armor responded instantaneously, drawing on the combat data it had gathered earlier. The leg piece's energy storage runes launched him over the palisade, landing him in the thick of the fight. "Artificer," one of the Rangers called out, relief evident in his voice. "Watch the crystals, they explode when damaged." Xander's armor was already adapting to this new information. The adaptive protection system increased power to areas facing the crystal-bearing creatures, while the helm's enhanced visibility helped him track multiple threats simultaneously. The battle flowed around him like a deadly dance. His armor moved with unprecedented synchronization, each piece working in perfect harmony. The creatures were stronger than the ones he'd fought on the road, but his armor was learning, evolving with each encounter. Then he saw it, a pattern in the chaos. The crystals weren't just weapons, they were changing the creatures, mutating them further even as he watched. More importantly, they all pulsed with the same rhythm, as if connected to a single source. "They're being controlled," he shouted to the nearest Ranger, a grizzled veteran wielding a runic bow. "The crystals are receiving energy from somewhere." The Ranger nodded grimly. "We figured as much. There's an old mining complex north of here. Started getting strange readings from it about a week ago, then these things showed up." Xander's mind raced as his armor continued to protect him from the onslaught. The crystals, the mutations, the timing, it all pointed to something he'd read about in his advanced runic studies. Someone, or something, was using crystalline resonance to affect local wildlife, turning them into weapons. A massive creature, more crystal than flesh, suddenly burst through the outpost's gate. Its very presence seemed to energize the smaller beings, making them fight with renewed fury. Xander's armor detected the surge in energy and adjusted accordingly, its runic systems working overtime to maintain protection. "Fall back to the inner compound," the veteran Ranger ordered. "We need to regroup." But Xander stood his ground, his armor's systems feeding him crucial data. The large creature's crystals were oscillating at a specific frequency, one that his runic knowledge identified as a control signal. If he could disrupt it. "Cover me," he called to the Rangers. "I need to get close to the big one." His armor's energy storage runes propelled him forward as the Rangers provided covering fire. The creature towered over him, its crystalline growths creating an otherworldly light show. But Xander's helm protected him from the mesmerizing effect, allowing him to focus on his target. Drawing on everything he knew about runic interference, he began modifying his armor's output on the fly. The adaptive protection system shifted, its runes realigning to emit a countering frequency. It was dangerous. If his calculations were wrong, the feedback could overload his entire runic network. The creature sensed his approach and struck with devastating force. But Xander's armor had anticipated the attack, redirecting the energy while maintaining his modified runic output. He pressed closer, feeling his armor's systems straining as they worked to disrupt the crystal's control frequency. Suddenly, the creature stumbled. Its crystals flickered erratically, their pulsing rhythm disrupted by Xander's interference. The smaller beings around them began to falter, their movements becoming uncoordinated. "Now!" Xander shouted. "Take them down while they're confused." The Rangers didn't waste the opportunity. Arrows and blades found their marks as the creature's coordinated defense fell apart. Without the controlling influence, they were just confused, mutated animals, dangerous, but manageable. The battle ended quickly after that. As the dust settled, Xander examined his armor, amazed by its performance. The runic systems had not only protected him but had adapted to counter a threat he hadn't even considered when designing them. The veteran ranger approached him, respect evident in his stance. "That was impressive work, Artificer. We've been trying to figure out how to counter these things for days." He handed Xander a worn map. "The mining complex is here. Whatever's causing this, that's where you'll find it." Xander studied the map, his armor systems finally cooling down from the intense battle. The crushing thoughts that had haunted him days ago seemed ridiculous now. He had proven himself, not just as an artificer, but as something new, a true combat artificer. As he helped the Rangers secure the outpost and tend to their wounded, Xander's mind was already working on improvements to his armor. The battle had shown him new possibilities, new ways to enhance his creation. But more importantly, it had shown him his path forward. The mystery of the crystals and their controller would have to be solved. And thanks to his revolutionary armor, he was uniquely qualified to do just that. He had created something that could adapt, learn, and grow, just like he would need to do. The sun set on the battered outpost, but for Xander, it felt more like a dawn. His journey as a combat artificer was just beginning, and he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The armor hummed softly, its runic systems already incorporating the day's lessons, preparing for the next battle. The first trial was complete, but the real adventure was just beginning.